Alright, for the third myth in my series on baseball's steroid era, I want to talk about players' bodies. This is another thing you hear a lot from baseball fans about players in the 1990s. In my original video, a lot of the comments I got were something to the effect of, look how huge they all got, look at how big they got. So we need to address this myth that steroids are the main reason that players got bigger during the steroid era. But before we even go there, I want to acknowledge how weird it is to talk about this subject and just say that part of the reason for this series, and part of the reason I don't like all the assumptions and myths about steroids in the first place, is that they all come with this undercurrent of regulating people's bodies. You shouldn't be that big. That's unnatural. I can tell by looking at you that you're on drugs. These are the kinds of statements that come with these myths. This is all just a really gross and dehumanizing way of talking about people, and it's not really fair or right in most circumstances. First of all, it's just rude to comment on a stranger's body type or physical appearance. And without more information, without medically examining somebody or having more intimate knowledge, there's just not a lot you can say about the way someone's body looks or acts with any degree of confidence. Yet here we are. And look, if that sounds harsh, I get why people say the stuff they say. I understand the reason. We know that steroids do help people add muscle and build mass, especially in their upper body. So if someone starts to look jacked all of a sudden, it's certainly fair to wonder if steroids were the cause.
Rob McElhenney, can you please tell me how in the hell you got so ripped, putting us all into shame after that transformation? Okay, I'm gonna break it down for you because it's actually quite simple. And anybody can do this. Anybody on the planet can do this. First things first, if you have a job, like a 9-to-5 job, quit that. Now, do you like food? Forget about that, because you're never gonna enjoy anything you eat. Alcohol, sorry, that's out. So what you're gonna need to do is you have a chef, right? Like a personal chef. So make sure the chef makes you a lot of chicken breast, and make sure you keep your caloric intake at a certain level. And as you go to your physician 2 to 3 times a week, just to monitor all your testosterone levels, because testosterone is important to building muscle. Rachel Millman says, Max from Always Sunny's was better and realer. I hope you're watching this, Camille. They both failed to mention how this actually works, which is steroids. Rachel, I'm not gonna get into the medical science of it. Let me just tell you something. Increased levels of testosterone is just a cross I have to bear. Some men just have elevated levels of testosterone. And I would say, if you look at Kumail, and if you look at me, you'd be like, well, sure, those two guys must have elevated levels of testosterone naturally, because they're just, alpha dog monsters.
The problem comes when you start to generalize about people, or in this case, a whole generation of baseball players. As Mac from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia gets at in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way in that clip, testosterone levels vary from person to person, and there are many other things that can impact a person's ability to get shredded. Drugs can be a part of it, but when it comes to baseball's so-called steroid era, the focus on drugs actually covers up a lot more details than it reveals. So to address this myth, first we have to draw a distinction between two different versions of it. The first is to look at hitters as a group and say that power hitters in the 1990s look different from power hitters of previous baseball eras. Mark McGwire was a bigger guy than, say, Carl Yastrzemski. But the other version of this is to look at one specific guy and say steroids changed his body. This is where people look at photos of Barry Bonds in the early 90s or the 80s even, and they compare those to photos of him in the late 90s and early 2000s. And clearly he looks very different. His body certainly changed. But these are really two different claims, and even though they're related, it's best not to conflate the two. Steroids might have an impact on one specific person, but the larger trend might be different. So let's start with that first one. Let's go back to before the steroid era. Look at sluggers of baseball's glory days. Guys like Babe Ruth, and Willie Mays, and Hank Aaron, those were the top 3 home run hitters in baseball history prior to the steroid era. And these guys were not that big. Well, Babe Ruth was big, but he didn't have the physique of a steroid user. He was pudgy, he had like a gut. Most sluggers were lean. Mickey Mantle, Harmon Killebrew, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron. None of these guys are listed at even 200 pounds on their baseball reference page. If you believe the back of their baseball cards, most of them tended to clock in around 180 or 190. One quick side note on this that makes this discussion a little difficult is how often people lie on their cards, or how often people would exaggerate or fudge their weight. This is a normal thing. People lie about their weight all the time. But it seems like people go in different directions. It seems like in older times, there was incentives to make yourself seem thinner and leaner than you were. And so guys who seemed like they were probably over 200 pounds were often listed at 190 or 195. And today, the opposite happens, where guys want to seem bigger and buffer than they really are. So they're listed at 240, 250, when if you look at them, they're probably less than that. But who knows? I think that this is why all this gets very, very tricky. But back in the pre-1990s era, the conventional wisdom was that you didn't really want to be huge if you were a baseball player. That's why guys would pretend they were thinner than they really were. The thinking was that being too big, having too much mass, even if it was muscle, that would mess up your swing. It would keep you from being flexible and resilient over a long 162-game season. It would cause injuries and endurance issues. But then, around the late 1980s and early 1990s, that started to change. But it's important to zoom out a little and realize that this was a trend across all sports. Advances in weight training, as well as just the increased popularity of bodybuilding, had more athletes going to the weight room and adding muscle. It was happening in football, it was happening in track and field, it was happening in basketball, it was happening in tennis. If you look at great athletes from the 1970s in almost any sport, whether it's John McEnroe or Bill Walton or Hank Aaron, they are almost all thinner than comparable athletes in those sports from the 1990s. Now, steroids were certainly part of this story. Steroid scandals popped up in a lot of sports from the late 70s through the 90s. And of course, part of the reason the steroid scandal broke in baseball is that there is evidence that the use of steroids significantly increased during this period. The story that emerges, both from whistleblowers like Porter Fisher and Brian McNamee, and also players who admitted using drugs like McGuire and Canseco, is that steroids were a common part of workout culture in that era. That if you hung out in gyms long enough and you were lifting weights, it was almost inevitable that you would at least be offered steroids, and it would be relatively easy to obtain them if you wanted them. But the salient thing is that players were in the gyms and lifting weights in the first place. That was the real change that happened in the steroid era. That was somewhat novel and reflected a change in the thinking around the sport, as players that had previously been discouraged from putting on muscle were actually encouraged to work out and lift weights and get bigger. Back in that first video I did, I talked about how Mark McGuire represented a major change in the way baseball sluggers were seen. He and Canseco were built like football players that had broad shoulders and big biceps and forearms. It was a real departure from guys like Ernie Banks or even a contemporary of McGuire's like Ken Griffey Jr. So there is some truth to that version of this myth. Sluggers in the 1990s really were bigger than sluggers from previous eras, but it's silly to attribute this primarily to steroids. There were a whole host of changes to how athletes were training across all sports that led to athletes getting bigger. Athletes in every sport were getting bigger, and many of the biggest hitters in the 1990s were never connected to steroids. Frank Thomas, for example, was listed at 6'5" and 245 pounds on his rookie card. He had originally gone to Auburn on a football scholarship, but the White Sox drafted him in 1989, and 2 years later he finished third in MVP voting. Thomas, it's worth noting, was always an outspoken critic of steroid use and a vocal proponent of increased testing. This doesn't necessarily mean he never used steroids, but there's never been any evidence that he did, and he was huge in high school. That's why he went to Auburn for football. So you can't do that thing where you look at the before and after photos and say, oh, obviously steroids are why he's so big. He was just a big guy who probably would have been overlooked in previous eras. And yet, Thomas emerged as a big star, but if you look at his home run totals, they followed the same pattern as the rest of the league in the 1990s. In 1993, when the juiced ball was introduced, Frank Thomas hit 41 home runs, a 70% spike from his total the previous season. And importantly, none of his other numbers went up, so it's not like that was the year he entered his prime and finally made the leap and became a great player. His batting average was down, his on-base percentage was down, his total games played was down, and yet his total home runs and his slugging percentage were up. Why? Not because he got bigger, but because the ball changed. In other words, even though players were getting bigger, that was not what was causing the increase in home runs. It's just that players who in previous eras would have been overlooked or encouraged to lose weight were now being scouted or actively encouraged to gain weight. Frank Thomas was not unique. In addition to the big hurt, Frank Thomas, there was also the big cat, Andres Galarraga, who was initially overlooked by teams in the 80s because he was considered too big, too overweight. He also emerged as a star power hitter in the 1980s and 90s. Jim Thome and Jeff Bagwell, they both became sluggers after being encouraged to add muscle mass. Albert Bell, Vladimir Guerrero, Mike Piazza, all these guys were bigger, buffer guys than you would typically see in previous baseball eras. None of them were ever tied to illegal steroids by any real evidence. Maybe one or two of these names were actually using PEDs and they just got away with it. But the point is that the trend towards bigger hitters included steroid users and non-steroid users alike. The cause wasn't steroids alone, it was the larger trend happening across all of sports. So even though it's tempting to look at the big home run hitters of the 90s and say, oh, it must have been steroids that made them all so big, that actually ignores the larger trend in which hitters in general and really all athletes were getting bigger. Steroids were not the primary cause because the trend included guys who never used PEDs. To be clear, some players certainly did resort to steroids in their attempts to get bigger. Guys like Jose Canseco and Ken Caminetti admitted as much. Then that brings us to the second version of this myth, which is those before and after photos, looking at one specific player and saying steroids changed his body. Bonds is the most commonly cited example of this, but people will do this with everyone from the steroids era, using small changes in their bodies as some kind of smoking gun. Everybody's sort of an expert in how big people are supposed to be naturally when they are talking about the steroid era. But athletes get bigger for all kinds of reasons. Steroids can certainly help, but they're not the only way to do it. And without other evidence, like we have in the case of Bonds and McGuire and Canseco, the mere fact that you added muscle isn't proof of anything. Plus, these players were often taking steroids in very unsophisticated ways, so it likely did not always have the desired effect. Caminetti, for example, told Sports Illustrated that he drove down to Mexico and bought something at a pharmacy there that had the word testosterone on it. The public talks about steroids like they're Popeye's spinach, magically inflating your forearms on command. But in order to see the benefits of steroid use, you typically need to be on some kind of concerted weight training regimen. You can't just pop a pill and grow to 240 pounds. I don't say any of this to absolve the guys who were caught using steroids. They were definitely trying to gain an edge. But just like the increase in the home run rate was a league-wide trend that was happening independent of steroid use, I think these games people play when they look at big muscles and say, we caught another steroids guy, they similarly ignore the larger context in which the league was emphasizing size in a way it never had before. This is a little trickier because obviously the emphasis on size drove some players to try PEDs, so they weren't perfectly independent trends the way the ball and the steroid use were. But I don't think it's correct to say that steroids were the main cause of the increase in player size. And finally, it's worth pointing out that all this focus on size may have been completely misplaced. It's not like bigger guys automatically hit more home runs. If you look at the game's best home run hitters today, yeah, you see guys like Aaron Judge and Vladimir Guerrero Jr., that is big, burly guys who are listed at over 230 pounds. But you also see guys like Matt Olson and Shohei Ohtani, who led the NL and AL respectively this last season in home runs. You see guys like Marcus Semien and Mookie Betts and Brandon Lau, all of whom are built very differently, not like you would expect a steroid user to be built. They're obviously strong guys, but they don't have the physiques that you saw in the 90s, guys like McGuire and Canseco, and Frank Thomas and Albert Bell all having. In other words, there's more than one way to build a power hitter, and it's just not as simple as shooting yourself up with a bunch of drugs to add muscle mass and hit more home runs. Even in the 1990s, there were guys like Ken Griffey Jr. and David Justice and Rafael Palmeiro who more closely resembled home run hitters from previous eras. The fact is, upper body strength and muscle mass are a small part of what it takes to hit home runs, so all this policing of people's bodies is really beside the point. And we should really question why we're engaging with this kind of discourse in the first place.